In a muddy, tree-lined corridor in Germany, under the cold rain of a continent divided, a new kind of terror takes shape. It is 1962 and the world holds its breath, squeezed between two superpowers who do not blink. But the greatest threat is not a city-bursting bomb launched from a distant silo. It is a weapon so small, so mobile, and so obscene that it will bend doctrine, warp psychology, and terrify the Kremlin, not because it is large, but because it is tiny, and it has been placed in the hands of ordinary soldiers. The year is 1968, arguably the most volatile year of the entire Cold War. It is a year of cascading crises, of assassinations that shake a nation to its core, of student uprisings that shatter the cobblestones of Paris and Prague, and of political shockwaves that rattle the leadership of both superpowers. Amid this global turmoil, far from any human eye, in the silent, crushing blue of the Pacific, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine begins its final, fateful voyage. K-129, a Golf II-class nuclear-armed submarine, slips beneath the surface and vanishes into the deep. It carries 3 ballistic missiles capable of striking the western United States, advanced cryptographic systems, classified navigation logs, and 83 Soviet sailors, and then without warning, it disappears. No distress call, no SOS, no trace. What follows will become one of the most ambitious intelligence operations in history. But this story is not about that submarine. It is about a weapon whose very existence made such high stakes, gambles a daily reality, a weapon that brought the apocalypse from the heavens down to the mud. This is the story of the Davy Crockett. The line between East and West Germany was more than a political boundary. It was a seam of geological destiny. Known to military planners on both sides as the Fulda Gap, this corridor of open, rolling land framed by dense forests and rising hills was the natural invasion route into Western Europe. If the armoured columns of the Warsaw Pact ever rolled west, their first thunder would be heard in these meadows and across these hedgerows. It was the designated ground zero of World War III. In the autumn mists that clung to the hills, Soviet observers manned their concrete outposts, their days a quiet, tense ritual of watching. Through powerful lenses and electronic gear, they were trained to see the big instruments of war, the distinctive, low-slung silhouettes of NATO tanks, the rumble of heavy missile transporters on distant roads, the electronic sweep of bombers on their radar scopes. In their doctrine, power was synonymous with size. Nuclear weapons were cathedral spires of steel in secret silos and city-bursting clouds that reached the stratosphere. A nuclear blast, in their worldview, was an act initiated by presidents and delivered by massive rockets, not something created by sergeants in jeeps. So when it happened, their training was not just challenged, it was mocked. On a cold, moonless night, a blinding flash, brighter than the sun for a fraction of a second, stabbed the darkness less than 2 miles from the border. The light vanished in a heartbeat, leaving behind a lingering purple afterimage on the observers' retinas. Then their instruments screamed. Geiger counters chattered hysterically. Radiometers pegged hard into the red. It was an unmistakable nuclear fingerprint, but it was all wrong. There had been no missile arc, no telltale howl of jet aircraft, none of the seismic or acoustic signatures of a massive detonation. Something had detonated, but it was small, surgically lethal, and it had happened at ground level. What was this? A sabotage team with a dirty bomb? A conventional artillery round that had somehow become trapped and gone critical? The initial theories, scribbled in frantic reports back to Moscow, fell apart against the cold, hard data. High-altitude reconnaissance photos of the area showed nothing but ordinary military activity. There were tire tracks from light utility vehicles, jeeps. There were footprints. There were no transporter erector launchers, TELs. There were no surface-to-surface missile launchers. The instrument that had produced that impossible flash was not a Dragon, but a scorpion, small, hidden in the dirt, and lethally venomous. The psychological shock of that intelligence report when it reached the Kremlin was not simply technical. It undermined an entire system of strategic thought. The core principle of nuclear deterrence was centralized control. The decision to end the world was supposed to be in the hands of one or two men locked away in deep bunkers. But if nuclear weapons could now be miniature and tactical, if they could be carried in a box, assembled by a small team, and possibly fired at the platoon level, then all the old, stable assumptions of deterrence would break. The American political language was already changing. The old doctrine of massive retaliation was giving way to a new, more ambiguous and far more terrifying strategy: flexible response. This weapon was the physical embodiment of that flexibility. The Soviets could no longer be sure where the next flash might come from. Every ditch, every quiet hedgerow, every patch of dark forest along the Fulda Gap could now be armed not just with a machine gun, but with the atom itself. Moscow's best engineers and physicists were convened. They pored over the data, their lectures filled with the arcane language of critical masses and implosion geometries. A stable sub-kiloton nuclear reaction, they reasoned, was a monumental feat of engineering. It required a heavy spherical containment vessel, a dense tamper to reflect neutrons, and a complex array of perfectly synchronized explosive lenses to crush a plutonium core into criticality. This, they concluded, was not something that could simply be strapped to the back of a jeep. But the flashes in the German night persisted. Wherever this strange new American unit maneuvered on their exercises, the background radiation counters twitched. What terrified the Kremlin was not just the existence of a portable nuclear warhead, it was the chilling implication of the doctrine behind it. It meant the Americans had made a conscious decision to distribute the power of apocalypse outward and downward to the level of the individual infantryman. This was a doctrine of sacrifice, a philosophy that was utterly alien to the Soviet model of top-down control. It rewrote the very meaning of forward defense. Where once the idea was to defend territory with massed divisions of tanks and the overarching threat of strategic bombers, now the map of the Fulda Gap was transformed. It was no longer a corridor for maneuver, but a potential patchwork of radioactive death zones. Every hedgerow was a potential firing point. Every trench line was a potential tomb. The Americans had placed a nuclear matchbox in the hands of their young men on the front lines and asked them to stand their ground in the path of an armored tide. The world had built a system to prevent nuclear war. The Americans, it seemed, had just built a system to start one. As Soviet intelligence analysts grappled with the terrifying implications of this new doctrine, their technical teams worked feverishly to identify the hardware. What they eventually discovered, through a combination of espionage, signals intelligence, and careful observation of NATO exercises, was a weapons system so bizarre and seemingly primitive that it only deepened their confusion. The device they had codenamed the Melon was the W-54 Warhead, one of the smallest and lightest nuclear packages ever constructed by any state. Weighing roughly 50 pounds, it was a compact, oblong device that looked, unsettlingly, like a small watermelon. It was designed to be carried by a single man and loaded onto a simple, almost crude, launcher. This was not a weapon of grand, strategic destruction, optimized for blast and rubble. Its purpose was far more sinister. It was a radiation weapon designed to produce an intense, localized burst of prompt neutrons and gamma rays. Its yield was dramatically low compared to the city-killing bombs in the arsenals of both superpowers, ranging from a mere 10 to 20 tons of TNT equivalent, barely more powerful than the largest conventional bombs. Its effect, however, was uniquely ugly. Fired at a column of advancing tanks, the Davy Crockett was not designed to blow them apart. It was designed to flash irradiate the crews inside. At close range, it could produce a prompt radiation dose so massive that it would incapacitate and kill the men inside their steel hulls, even if the tank itself remained physically untouched. It was a weapon that killed the ghost in the machine, leaving behind a perfectly intact, but now crewless, armored vehicle. The delivery systems for this warhead, the M-28 and M-29 Davy Crockett weapon systems, were equally, almost absurdly, straightforward. They consisted of a simple, smoothbore recoilless launch tube, which could be mounted on a heavy tripod on the ground or adapted crudely to a pintle mount in the bed of a jeep. The weapon had a ballistic arc like a small mortar, with a maximum range of only a couple of kilometers for the smaller M28 and up to 4 kilometers for the larger M29. The aiming system was shockingly primitive. It consisted of a small 37mm spotting rifle that fired a phosphorus round. The three-man crew would fire the spotting rifle, observe where the puff of smoke landed, and then adjust their aim before loading the heavy, bulbous nuclear warhead. Most terrifying of all from the Soviet perspective was the weapon's lack of complex safeguards. There were no permissive action links, the sophisticated electronic locks that required a code from a higher authority before the weapon could be armed. While official authorization to use the weapon was a story of complex command chains and presidential memoranda, in practice, the physical mechanism on the ground could be operated by a three-man crew with a key and a simple firing trigger. To the Soviet mind, steeped in a culture of absolute central control, the implications were monstrous. They had planned for large, strategic weapons controlled by formal political decisions in distant capitals. They had not planned for a piece of hardware so small and so widely distributed that a frightened 20-year-old corporal in a muddy ditch could, in a moment of panic, light the fuse of a nuclear war. The reality of this new weapon was made brutally clear during tests and demonstrations. At exercises in West Germany, American soldiers would unpack the Davy Crockett from its transport crates in a muddy field with an almost shabby familiarity. This was not a cathedral-like engine of war guarded by elite technicians inside a sterile concrete silo. Troops in standard combat gear would lift the 50-pound warhead and mount it on the launcher as if they were loading a heavy crate of ammunition, not a closely guarded state secret. The instrument itself looked almost comical, a bulbous teardrop-shaped projectile sat upon the end of a thin, spindly tube. But it worked. At the Nevada test site, a demonstration was held for high-ranking generals and politicians. They stood behind reinforced glass, wearing dark goggles, as a small crew on the desert floor shouldered the launcher. A puff of dust from the spotting rifle appeared downrange. The crew made a minor adjustment, a brief pause, and then the propellant charge fired with a dull thump, sending the warhead arcing slowly into the sky. It wobbled in its flight, visibly drifting in the wind. It landed several hundred yards short of its designated aim point. Then it burst with a silent, searing flash and an invisible pulse of lethal energy. What the spectators in the bunker did not fully absorb in that moment of awesome power was the grim arithmetic of survival for the crew on the ground. The Davy Crockett's lethal radiation pulse had a radius that was nearly as wide as the weapon's own maximum range. A firing error of a few hundred meters, a sudden shift in the wind, a slight miscalculation in the primitive aiming system, any of these could place the firing crew themselves inside the lethal radiation zone. The generals saw the ugly reality of the weapon they had created. It was a system that could be used by low-level crews in the chaos of a muddy hedgerow fight, but its margin for error was terrifyingly, almost suicidally, small. It was a weapon built to be used in the instant of a desperate crisis, but crisis, as they all knew, is the mother of chaos and miscalculation. The existence of the Davy Crockett placed an immense psychological weight on both sides of the Iron Curtain, a strange test of will that bred paranoia in one superpower and a deep sense of revulsion in the other. For the Soviets, the weapon was a nightmare of tactical uncertainty. Their entire doctrine for a European land war was predicated on the ability to mass thousands of tanks and armoured vehicles at a single point, the Schwerpunkt, to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The Fulda Gap was the ideal theatre for such a strategy. But how can you mass tanks if every bush, every quiet German farmhouse, every wooded copse might conceal a small team of men with a grenade that spits neutron fire? The Davy Crockett turned the battlefield from a chessboard of predictable movements into a minefield of invisible, radioactive threats. This deep paranoia permeated every level of Soviet strategic planning. Intelligence reports marked top secret, special importance, flooded into the Kremlin, filled with grainy photographs of American jeeps with the strange tubular launcher mounted in the back. Analysts re-evaluated their armor doctrine. Maps were redrawn. The Fulda Gap, once depicted in their war plans with confident sweeping arrows of movement, became a patchwork of potential nuclear death zones. Soviet commanders were forced to design a whole new set of countermeasures and revised assault tactics. They studied the physics of neutron shielding, experimented with boron-lined armor plating, and developed doctrines of rapid dispersal, all aimed at preventing the Americans from using these tactical nuclear choke points to halt an armored thrust. A weapon that had never been fired in anger had already succeeded in forcing their enemy to rewrite their entire operational plan. But perhaps more important than the tactical changes was the profound psychological impact. A weapon that could be launched by a junior sergeant fundamentally changed the nature of nuclear deterrence. It undermined the grim but stable logic of mutually assured destruction, which rested on the idea that the decision to use nuclear weapons was the sole, solemn preserve of the heads of state. The Davy Crockett introduced the terrifying variable of unpredictability. The Soviet leaders began to fear not just a deliberate, calculated first strike from Washington, but the chaos of the battlefield itself, the desperation of a surrounded American unit, the panic of a frightened young soldier with his finger on the trigger, any small local event that could cascade uncontrollably into a full strategic exchange. They had spent decades building a system to control the apocalypse, and now the Americans had seemingly put the detonator in the hands of thousands. On the American side, the weapon forced a series of deeply uncomfortable conversations in the halls of power. The U.S. Army, desperate for a way to counter the Warsaw Pact's overwhelming numerical superiority in tanks, argued passionately that it must be granted the tactical flexibility to use the Davy Crockett. They saw it as the ultimate equalizer, the only thing that could stop an armored onslaught in the first crucial hours of a war. But the Pentagon and the White House were increasingly wary of the dangers of uncontrolled escalation. There were serious and often heated debates about the prudence of placing such devices in the hands of junior officers, far from the direct, minute-by-minute control of the National Command Authority. The field commanders stationed in West Germany lived with this awful calculus every single day. Their defensive posture required them to maintain forward positions, to conduct mobile patrols, and to be in a constant state of readiness along the border. Each jeep-mounted team equipped with a Davy Crockett was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they represented a credible, terrifying deterrent, a thin red line that could, in theory, stop a Soviet armored breakthrough dead in its tracks. But on the other hand, each of those teams was a potential spark in a global tinderbox. The decision to use the weapon would mean deliberately irradiating German soil, killing countless civilians and soldiers, possibly their own, and in doing so, risking a full-scale Soviet strategic response. And what of the soldiers themselves, the young men tasked with operating this doomsday machine? For many of them, the weapon was an object of hatred and fear. They understood the suicide math all too well. They were junior, non-commissioned officers and enlisted men, told to sit in a muddy ditch with a device that could blast them with a lethal dose of radiation if the winds shifted unexpectedly, or if a simple aiming miscalculation occurred. The psychological burden was immense. Morale in the Davy Crockett units was notoriously low. The weapon was not seen as a tool of heroism. It was a curse, a 50-pound ball of plutonium that represented an existential threat, not just to the enemy, but to themselves. They were, in the most literal sense, sitting on a time bomb, waiting for an order they prayed would never come. From Moscow, the reaction to this strange, decentralized threat was severe and multifaceted. As their intelligence painted a clearer picture of the Davy Crockett's capabilities and widespread deployment, a quiet but frantic effort began to counter it. This was not just a military problem, it was an ideological one. The weapon's existence mocked the Soviet obsession with grand, centralized power. The Kremlin's first response was doctrinal. War games and simulations were run and rerun, producing unsettling and often catastrophic endings. The models showed that rather than deterring a Soviet offensive, the Davy Crockett was more likely to accelerate escalation. A limited tactical nuclear volley from a Davy Crockett unit that successfully incapacitated a Soviet tank column would almost certainly invite a retaliatory strike from a much larger theater-level Soviet nuclear weapon. The chain of command, imperfect, delayed by bureaucracy, and brittle under the stress of combat, could not be guaranteed to act with the cool, rational restraint that the American doctrine of flexible response seemed to assume. The fear in Moscow was that a small fire in the Fulda Gap would inevitably lead to a global conflagration. But in Washington, a new and parallel worry was dawning. The very system the army cherished as its ultimate defense was proving to be a political and strategic time bomb in other ways. The weapon's shocking inaccuracy, its susceptibility to wind, and the almost complete absence of modern safety safeguards made it as dangerous to its users and to nearby civilians as it was to its intended targets. Classified test results showed a disturbingly wide circular error probable, and when human factors like adrenaline, stress, and the fog of war were factored in, the weapon's performance degraded even further. The Davy Crockett was a tool of chaos, not of precision. By the late 1960s, the political climate in the West began to change. The doctrine of flexible response matured, and the emphasis shifted away from crude, low-yield battlefield nukes and toward the development of highly accurate, precision-guided conventional weapons. The Davy Crockett, once rolled out as the thin red line against an armored onslaught, slowly and quietly became a strategic liability, a relic of a more desperate and less sophisticated era. The smallest bomb had created the biggest headache. The end of the Davy Crockett came not with a dramatic congressional vote or a public treaty, but with the quiet, bureaucratic shuffle of a weapon whose time had passed. There was no single, catastrophic event that led to its demise. Instead, it was a slow, creeping realization in the halls of the Pentagon that the weapon was a strategic dead end. History would later reveal a series of problems that were almost farcical and at the same time almost tragic. The weapon's notorious inaccuracy, its extreme susceptibility to wind, and the glaring absence of modern safeguards made it as much of a danger to its own users and allied territory as it was to its intended targets. Classified tests had consistently shown a wide circular error, and when human factors, the adrenaline of combat, the stress of being under fire, the simple possibility of a misunderstanding were factored in, the weapon's performance degraded to the point of being almost random. By the late 1960s, the political and strategic climate of the Cold War began to shift. The raw, terrifying logic of the early nuclear age was giving way to a more nuanced, if no less dangerous, reality. The American doctrine of flexible response matured, and its emphasis moved away from crude, uncontrollable tactical nukes and toward the development of precision-guided conventional systems, mobile armor, and advanced anti-tank missiles. The Davy Crockett, once hailed as the ultimate thin red line against a Soviet armored onslaught, slowly and quietly became a political and military liability. There was no dramatic press conference announcing its retirement. The weapon simply faded away. Launchers were unbolted from jeeps. The W-54 warheads were recalled from their forward-deployed positions in Europe and Korea. Crews were reassigned to conventional mortar platoons. By the early 1970s, the Davy Crockett was officially retired from service. The small, watermelon-sized warheads were taken to dismantlement facilities, their plutonium cores repurposed or secured. The photographs and the strange, primitive-looking manuals found their way into dusty government archives. The official record shows a weapon that was removed from the arsenal less because it failed to frighten the enemy, and more because, in its chaotic and unpredictable nature, it frightened everyone too much. The Davy Crockett survives today mostly in museums, a historical oddity. It sits on its spindly tripod, a faded, inert projectile resting in the launch tube, accompanied by a small placard that reads with clinical understatement, "Tactical Nuclear System." Tourists pass by it, seeing it as just another strange artifact of a bygone era. But its true legacy is more than the object itself. It is a profound moral and doctrinal lesson, a physical embodiment of a terrifying idea, the danger of decentralizing the power to start a catastrophe. It represents the inherent perils of equipping field units with devices whose political consequences are far beyond their control, and it stands as a stark reminder of the incredible fragility of rational command during a crisis. The Soviets, for their part, never really tried to copy the system. Faced with the reality of the Davy Crockett, they instead doubled down on what they knew: heavy rockets, massed artillery, and a rigidly centralized command and control structure. Perhaps they recognized the inherent insanity of a weapon so small it could bypass the authority of the state. Or perhaps more pragmatically, the struggling Soviet economy could simply not sustain the mass fielding of thousands of similar miniature systems. What remains is the psychological echo that rippled across the Iron Curtain for years. In the war rooms of the Warsaw Pact, commanders were forced to imagine their prized tank divisions driving into a kill zone, where their armor could be silently neutralized from a hedgerow, where their crews would die with the engines still idling, killed by an invisible pulse of energy from a weapon they never saw. It is worth pausing on one final bitter irony. A nation like the Soviet Union, which had proclaimed its absolute monopoly on strategic decision-making with its massive state-controlled arsenals, found itself strategically stung and doctrinally paralyzed by a tiny device that denied it a neat, symmetrical response. The Davy Crockett was not, in the end, a great weapon of war. It was never fired in anger, but it was a powerful test of how much danger a civilization could socialize, how far down the chain of command the authority to end the world could be dispersed before the very fabric of escalation unraveled. In the end, the test answered itself, not very far. The Fulda Gap remained a scar on the maps of Europe for decades. The armored exercises continued, the political tensions persisted, but the brief, terrifying moment when a watermelon-sized warhead on the back of a jeep made generals on both sides question the very nature of command and control has passed into memory. The story of the Davy Crockett is a warning wrapped in metal and fissile material. It is a cautionary tale that teaches us that when technology permits the power of the atom to be taken from the silo and placed in the ditch, the established rules of politics and war bend in unpredictable and terrifying ways. The smallest devices can sometimes pose the gravest dangers, not because of their brute force, but because they reassign the power to begin the end of the world to those least able to weigh its consequences. In the quiet, climate-controlled halls of museums and on the dusty, wind-swept plains of abandoned test ranges, the spindly launchers await the curious. They are relics of a dangerous idea and testaments of a sober judgment. They are proof that in an age of constant invention, the truest and most difficult question is not whether we can build something, but whether we should. This was the Davy Crockett, the jeep that could have started the final war.